I'm Bernd Schäfer. I'm a senior scholar with the Cold War International History Project, and I'm sitting in today for Christian Ostermann, who sends his regrets that he cannot make it today. So I'm going to be your moderator for this morning. We will have a lecture by Christoph Bluth, and he's going to talk for about 45 to 60 minutes about a subject you obviously know about, because you just came for that reason. It's on the Mutual Balanced Force Reductions negotiations, MBFR, which went on and on and on during the Cold War in Europe. And he's going to talk about deterrent and military security in Europe, and he has really insight into some new available released archival material, as I've heard mostly from the East German side, but which will shed a lot of light on the Soviet Warsaw Pact side of the negotiations. Let me first briefly introduce you to the speaker, and then the floor will be his for a while. Christoph Bluth is Professor of International Studies at the University of Leeds in the UK. And before coming to Leeds, he was Professor of International and European Studies at the University of Reading, also in the UK. While he was working at King's College in London, Bluth worked with Sir Lawrence Freedman and Robert O'Neill on the four-nation nuclear history program before taking up a lectureship in international relations at the University of Essex. His research interests are in international security studies, especially nuclear weapons policies and the prevention of the spread of weapons of mass destruction, with a regional expertise in Russia and Eurasia, Pakistan, Iraq, Germany, and Northeast Asia, especially Korea, North Korea. He is currently involved in a Leeds University initiative on terrorism and also the Korean Research Hub, the Universities of Leeds and Sheffield in the UK. He has authored numerous publications, including The Two Germanys and Military Security in Europe in 2002, and many ever since, The Nuclear Challenge, Germany and the Future of European Security, and Security Dilemmas in Russia and Eurasia. We are very glad to have you here, and we're looking forward to your talk and hope for some new interesting insights on the subject. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. As you probably are aware, this is a research project in progress. So what I'm going to try to do is, first of all, explain some of the research questions that I'm trying to address. I'm going to talk a little bit about the source materials that I'm researching. I'm obviously very happy to hear from you any kinds of additional research analysis of the research questions that you might have. But having already done some work in the archives, I also can give you a tantalizing glimpse of what might be in the archives and what kind of answers we might get to some of these questions. The particular sources I'm using for this particular topic is basically the file of the East German delegation to the MBFR talks. I briefly explain the structure of these files. What they generally consist of is an explanation to the East German government, National Security Council, about the progress in the negotiations, the interests of the eastern side, and the problems that they're facing, what they expect to happen next. There are protocols of the meetings with the Soviet delegation leader and various protocols of meetings with other people. The East Germans were particularly tasked to approach the West German side and find out what the West German side was up to. So I'll go a little bit into more details in a moment. What I've projected at the moment on this particular slide are the questions that I hope to address with this research. And the first of this really is to try and understand what is the role of the conventional balance in the East-West confrontation, given the preponderance of nuclear weapons and the threat of nuclear escalation, which was considered to provide deterrence against war. So why did the eastern side consider the conventional balance to be important? The second question is, why did the Soviet Union agree to participate in MBFR at all? Then, following on from that, how can we understand the strategic objectives of the Warsaw Pact in the negotiations? How do we explain the tactics that they adopted? And the fourth question here is, specifically, how do we explain the behavior of the eastern side on the so-called data question? And why was it so critical for the eastern side to preserve numerical superiority? Let me very briefly mention some of the principal insights that we can already get from the East German documents. First of all, I think it's very clear, not only from the East German documents, but from other information sources that we already have, is that initially the Soviet Union had no interest in MBFR, but then pursued negotiations in order to achieve CSCE. And I think one of the themes that comes through the documents is how constantly the Soviet Union is trying to separate basically CSCE from MBFR. And of course, the West German side initially insisted very much that there should be a military component to détente in Europe as well, that somehow the military imbalance in Europe had to be addressed. Now, I think that changed somewhat later on, that the Soviet Union actually did acquire a more genuine interest in MBFR. And what they were trying to achieve were two things. One is to retain the status quo. In other words, they believed that there was an imbalance, that there was superiority on the eastern side, and they wanted to be sure that, that this was codified in the negotiations. Secondly, they wanted to hedge against the qualitative improvement of NATO forces in the future. And this is quite an interesting theme. I think when you talk about negotiations that last as long as MBFR, you also have to be aware of the fact that military technology and the military balance is not constant but changes during that time. And how that affected the negotiations, I think, is also interesting. But let me just briefly summarize what as the objectives on the eastern side. First of all, the Warsaw Pact military planners remained wedded to the principles that their forces had to be superior to those of NATO. Otherwise, their military strategy could not be implemented. The military strategy being to use massive military force in the event of war to prevent escalation to the nuclear level and to occupy Western Europe as quickly as possible. And this strategy could not really be implemented without having a quantitative superiority in military forces. But there is also an internal political issue which has to do with the fact that the bargain that was struck between the military and the political leadership when Khrushchev was ousted was a general support for a general build-up in conventional and nuclear forces, and that should not be threatened by arms control negotiations. Then there is a third issue that is important and is a thread that runs both through the Eastern and Western attitude to the negotiations, which is that Soviet forces in Central Europe had a dual purpose, at least. One of which was obviously to do with the West. The other was to police the East European states. And that also meant that the East European side had to have a quantitative superiority. Thirdly, so what I'm saying is that the Eastern side had a genuine interest in achieving an agreement, but under its own terms. I have not found any evidence that says that they really didn't want an agreement at all. Although that was an impression, I think, that was sometimes generated in the West, but that was not the case, at least as far as these documents are concerned. And the agreement had to be based on equal percentage reductions or equal numerical reductions and maintain the existing balance, that is to ratify the status quo. Basic principles of for MBFR. First of all, MBFR should not just be a negotiation between the superpowers. It should include all foreign and domestic forces in the reduction region. Then it should include reduction of land forces, air forces, and units equipped with nuclear weapons. Now that's quite an important point. I'll come back to this a little bit later. We always think of MBFR as negotiations about conventional forces, but actually they wanted to include nuclear forces based in Europe as well. And that was really quite important to them. Reductions of entire units, and the units that were to be reduced should be completely demobilized. In other words, not just withdrawn, not American units to be just withdrawn back to the United States, but to actually be demobilized completely. Then there is the issue of the Bundeswehr. The inclusion of the Bundeswehr was a key objective for the eastern side in the negotiations. They considered the Bundeswehr to be the largest West European military power, although they did not want the forces to be reduced to come entirely from those stationed in West Germany. Nevertheless, all the forces stationed in West Germany had to be reduced, and in particular those of the Bundeswehr. And they also recognized that the forces of the NVA were in no way equivalent to those of the Bundeswehr. So the containment of West Germany, dealing with Western forces based in the Federal Republic of Germany, was a key objective that they wanted to achieve. Now, I think we can contrast this with the American objectives. What is interesting is, when we look at the history of MBFR, that there was actually some agreement between the eastern side and the West German side, because the West Germans also wanted to include their own forces in the negotiations, very much contrary to the American position. The Americans wanted that, at least in the initial phase, only Soviet and American forces would be included in the reductions. But what was driving the West German side was that they felt that they could not maintain the level of military spending without making some gesture in arms control, and thereby including West German forces. But of course, this issue was also contentious within West Germany itself. The inclusion of nuclear weapons was quite an important principle for the eastern side. And there are three sets of reasons that are given in the documents. First of all, political reasons. Political reasons are as follows. In the struggle of the socialist states to secure peace, effective measures to prevent nuclear war had the first priority. The high degree of military confrontation in Central Europe resulted principally from the fact that thousands of nuclear warheads and their means of delivery were deployed in the region. These weapon systems were the source of the greatest danger in a densely populated area. And of course, this contrasted quite strongly with the viewpoint in NATO. In NATO, it was the conventional imbalance that was seen as and the build-up of conventional forces in Central Europe that was seen as the greatest threat. Legal reasons are very simple. The communiqué of the 28th of June 1973, which stated that the mutual reduction of all armed forces and their armaments in the reduction area, not counting naval forces, would be the object of the negotiations in Vienna. So there was already the mandate to include nuclear forces as far as the eastern side was concerned. Military reasons, basically, at that time the Warsaw Pact considered that the NATO side had a preponderance in nuclear strike forces, especially nuclear-capable aircraft. And they felt that all of the existing military capabilities, ground troops, air forces, nuclear deployment forces, needed to be included in the negotiations. And that you couldn't meaningfully talk about the military balance unless nuclear armed units with nuclear munitions and delivery were included. In addition to that, of course, the arrival of dual-purpose forces reinforced the view that a whole range of weapons capabilities had to be included. Let me come to the data question. Now, the data question was very vexing, and the data question cast a lot of doubt over the seriousness of the Warsaw Pact in these negotiations, because for over 3 years, the Warsaw Pact refused to provide official figures about its own armed forces. And this kind of behavior seemed to undermine the very purpose and essence of these negotiations. Now, there are several issues in relation to that, and I'm going to give you a little bit of detail in a minute. But first of all, it arose simply from the fact that the Warsaw Pact wanted to preserve quantitative superiority. And if the data were revealed what that would clearly show was that there was a clear quantitative asymmetry in Europe. And this is what they wanted to avoid. They wanted to avoid discussions going down that road. And they wanted to avoid asymmetric reductions. That was one of their primary objectives. Now the question remains, why is it they felt they needed to have quantitative superiority? I already alluded to some of the issues here. I think in the initial, there were several phases in this. I think in the initial phase, quantitative superiority needed to be preserved as a requirement of military strategy. They felt that their military strategy could not be implemented unless they had that. Later on, and the reason why I put question marks behind these dates, I think this is an issue really that I would like to address further in the research. In other words, I would really be able to like to nail this one down, if it's possible from the documents, as to how this shift occurred and to what extent the different elements were important at what time. But we know very well, and we also know this from Yuli Kuczynski, who was the Soviet delegate to the negotiations, that the perception arose that Western armaments and Western training was far superior to that of the Warsaw Pact. In fact, they thought there was almost a balance of 1 to 3 in aircraft and tanks and so forth. What that meant is you needed a quantitative superiority in order to make up for the qualitative superiority. And that became much more dominant after the mid-70s. And I also referred already to the third point, which has to do that with the fact that Soviet forces in Eastern Europe had a policing role, and moreover, the reliability of the other Warsaw Pact forces was often in question, especially, of course, after 1968, the forces in Czechoslovakia were put in question, which raised was sort of a political asymmetry, if you like, in the region. So the data problem arose from the problem of avoiding asymmetrical reductions, but there was another problem. And that problem is very peculiar and unique to the Warsaw Pact side, which has to do with the fact that the data were not even being made available internally. It is one of these very peculiar facts that the Warsaw Pact diplomats, including Soviet diplomats, were not privy to the data. In fact, it is a very old fact. I mean, if you look at, for example, the semi-classified Soviet military literature of the time, all strategy, all military technology is discussed in terms of Western military technology. They never discuss their own systems. They never give their own numbers. Even, we know from Regatov, even in the SALT I negotiations, when the American side was starting to talk in terms of figures, which is in essence what the negotiations come down to, the Soviet military delegation, part of the delegation, told the Americans, please don't give any of this information to our own diplomats. And that afflicted also the Soviet side. So when I was looking at the East German documents, the figures discussed in the East German documents come from the International Institute for Strategic Studies. They don't come from the Soviet military. But they had this very difficult task. I mean, when you're talking about this for 3 years and you're trying to explain to the other side our numbers are the same as yours, in other words, there is no imbalance, how can you do this if you're not going to cite any figures? This is sort of a very fundamental epistemological problem that you have to deal with. I'll talk a little bit about this predicament in trying to create the fiction that the numbers were equal on both sides. For example, in order to reduce the level of ground forces, what they were doing is they were assigning the air defense and radio technical troops that belong to the ground forces to the Air Force. So changing the numbers that way, for example. Then they added some more NATO forces. For example, the 12,000 troop stations, NATO forces stationed in West Berlin were added to the NATO tally. Troops assigned to Pershing missiles in the Bundeswehr, 3,500 troops, were also put onto the NATO tally. And French troops stationed in the Federal Republic of Germany, about 60,000 were to be added to the total, even though France wasn't actually involved in the negotiations. So by this kind of juggling, they were able to reduce the disparity of 150,000 men to about 25,000 to 30,000, or 85 to 95,000 excluding the French forces. Basically, the documents revealed that it was considered to be a success if they could reduce the gap to below 100,000. That's the target which they set themselves. But I think it became, well, I think I'll go on to this next. So this is what I'm talking about, is where Warsaw Pact diplomats not privy to Soviet military data, and so they're trying to cook the books using Western data. We see, for example, that the military balance of the ISS at that time cited a figure of 90,000 ground forces for the NVA, and NATO alleged this to be 100,000. And so they're discussing, well, how is that possible? What is the disparity? Where are these 10,000 troops? But there's no discussion on their own, on the basis of their own internal numbers. Eventually, they did present figures. Let me just mention what they are. And here we see what the data that were presented. They claim to have 987,300 troops, including 805,000 land forces. And I give, by contrast, the Western estimates over 1 million, including 960,000 land forces. I think we should say for the West, it was quite difficult to keep a tally on these numbers, simply because troops were rotated a lot. And also, what is the definition of a soldier? You know, is somebody who works in the medical corps a soldier or not? I mean, those kinds of issues also affect the overall numbers, of course. But I think what is clear from the documents, I mean, to be absolutely clear, they believed themselves they had superiority. It's not that we alleged it, or that it was a counting issue simply. They were convinced they had superiority and they wanted to preserve it. That's absolutely crystal clear in the documents. When was this presented? This was presented on the 10th of June 1976. Quantity. Well, no, this doesn't include a qualitative analysis. Yeah, I think at that time, basically, in terms of quality, they were still quite convinced in the superiority of their tank forces, in particular, and they were convinced in the superiority of NATO airstrike forces, as far as I can tell from the documents. They are stronger. They believe they're stronger. It also says that the total number of Soviet forces that they presented on their tally was 40,000 lower than estimated by NATO at the time.
This figure is all Warsaw Pact.
These are Warsaw Pact. Those were the figures given in the negotiations, yeah. However, I mean, as I already pointed out, one of the key issues is that the military balance was not constant. Okay, so, and the documents reveal a very strong awareness of this fact. And here are some of the key points that I mentioned in the documents in relation to how the balance is shifting. First of all, it says the member states of NATO had a higher gross domestic product than those of the Warsaw Pact and were increasing their military expenditure. Considerable advances in military technology had been made in the West. These included fuels with new chemical properties, conventional explosives that were 5 to 6 times more powerful than previously used explosives, and precision-guided munitions that would allow the use of conventional weapons for the destruction of targets that previously could only be targeted with nuclear weapons. And there were also deficiencies in the Warsaw Pact which were noted, which were that there was an inadequate provision of modern weapons for the Warsaw Pact armies. And here we see something really quite important that is taking place, which is that the Soviet tank armies, which were the key asset that the Warsaw Pact had, were becoming obsolete over time. And this had to do with precision-guided weapons, with the density of anti-aircraft fire. Let me, sorry, before I go to this, let me briefly talk about, we're now looking, yes, sir. This is a range of documents from the late 70s to the late 80s, basically, right? Say again? Yeah, yeah. Okay, right. Well, we're glad to hear about that. I'm just referring to an article that was published in Vienna Missile in 1987, which demonstrated how new technologies were threatening the tank with obsolescence. And it basically stated that a sufficient density of anti-tank weapons could create a virtually impenetrable anti-tank wall. Assuming a tank deployment density of 40 per kilometer along the front line, a concentration of 20 anti-tank systems per kilometer along the front would suffice to destroy 90% of the entire tank force. So what the sense we get from the documents is that by the early 1980s, we're looking more at the struggle to preserve parity in the region. There's an interesting document which I found, which is a discussion between Yazov and Jaruzelski about the whole question of SDI. And what Yazov is saying, SDI is not going to happen. He says that literally. But what he says, they are using this new technology for other purposes. In other words, conventional technologies. And that clear implication is, we don't have some of these means yet. We need to catch up with the West. So there is a very clear sense in the 1980s that they're under very severe pressure in terms of the advances that are taking place in the West, and that they no longer have the kind of superiority that they thought they had in the early 70s. This is an analysis of the total forces deployed in the 1980s and the superiority that NATO has in various categories. And there's also an analysis of Warsaw Pact superiority. And we see the emphasis on aircraft in tactical aviation, on anti-tank complexes, whereas the Warsaw Pact has a clear superiority in tanks and launchers for tactical rockets and ACVs.
From what date are the statistics? What year?
Just check this if it's given here. Yeah, 1986, I think. Okay. And of course, we all know that MBFR came to a conclusion in the 1980s without any achieving any of its objectives. So I'm going to give a few reflections on that, what we can learn from MBFR, and I'd be happy to have your questions and your comments on this. First of all, I think we sort of conceived, at least in political science, we conceived of arms control as having both political and military purposes, and that the most important purpose was that of managing and mitigating tension between East and West. And the question is, well, where does MBFR fit into this? And we can also ask a question about CFE, because I think in terms of CFE, the roles were reversed. First of all, in terms of MBFR, MBFR was clearly the ticket the Soviet Union had to pay to get CSCE. Nevertheless, I think one of the remarkable things is that all the political objectives were achieved relatively quickly just by agreeing to negotiate. The Nixon administration wanted to defeat the Mansfield Amendment. The British government also had very severe political pressure on reducing conventional forces in Europe, and this problem was also solved with MBFR because you can't enter negotiations if you unilaterally withdraw. The German government actually was extremely interested in MBFR. It pushed MBFR so hard at the beginning, and then very soon it lost interest, basically, in MBFR. So there was no political pressure. All the political gains, if you like, the same thing for the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union got CSCE. There was no further political gains to be made in terms of MBFR. So really, all that we had was the technical side of arms control. That was extremely difficult, though. It was very, very complicated because of the complications of assessing the military balance, the disputes about the data, the very contrary objectives of the eastern and western side. The western side really wanted to achieve redressing the asymmetry. Now that was already, at that time, a very, very hard goal to achieve in terms of arms control. In the 1980s, that was different. Then we had very radical successes in arms control, which did achieve in eliminating imbalances, but in the 1970s, that was almost inconceivable, I think. And then there were other issues that had to do with the fact that on the NATO side, there was a perception that there was very little scope actually for significant reductions, because if the reductions went beyond 5%, then there was a question whether really the NATO could maintain its military strategy, actually. So there were questions even on the western side whether large-scale reductions were possible. The only ones pushing for large-scale reductions at one point were the Germans, where they had the idea of reducing by 25%. Now, the idea of reducing by 25% was based on the conception that then you could inhibit Soviet control over Eastern Europe. In other words, it was a Trojan horse to bring about political change in Eastern Europe and use arms control negotiations that way. And also they, of course, suggested these very elaborate associated measures which would have inhibited the movement of Soviet troops in the region as well. As far as MBFR and Soviet strategic objectives in Europe were concerned, again, I've pointed out quite a few of them. Obviously, the most important one is to codify the status quo and to preserve the capacity to maintain control over Eastern Europe, and to get a reduction in U.S. forces. I think that was quite important, and maintain also this geographic imbalance. One of the key issues that was bedeviling MBFR had to do with the geographic asymmetry. Because if you had to bring United States forces back to the United States, it would be much harder to redeploy them, whereas the Soviets just had to drive down the road. Interestingly, in the 1980s, there was a perception on the eastern side that this geographic asymmetry was no longer as relevant, because with the introduction of deep strike forces, with the capability of interdicting transport lines and the second echelon, this advantage seemed to have eroded very considerably. Then, of course, there's this question of the relationship between the Soviet Union and the East European forces. I call it the coalition of the unwilling. And what can this would be an interesting question, what can these sources tell us about relations between the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe? Of course, the very obvious thing is everybody knows Romania was completely rogue. And the MBFR documents confirm that. I mean, the Romanians, although technically on the eastern side, were constantly sabotaging the negotiations or the eastern position, were not really proper participants of MBFR in that sense. And as I said, this last point is reassessing the relationship between political and military technical aspects. What I think is interesting about CFE is that there the relationship was reversed. Because what happened was that the political changes leaped ahead of the negotiations. And what we found is that, in fact, the negotiation, well, as everybody knows, CFE had to catch up. Not only were the openings in Eastern Europe then this massive withdrawal of forces, as you know, first of all, the withdrawal of Soviet forces from East European countries, the withdrawal of equipment to beyond east of the Urals to escape CFE, and finally the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, then the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which again required a reassessment of CFE. So in this case, I think the purpose of arms control had changed as a means of just basically mopping up after all these political changes and solving these technical issues. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for this interesting talk. Let's give him a hand. Very good. So we have plenty of time for some questions and discussion. So I'm looking forward to your remarks.
Hi, Josh Shiffrinson. I'm a PhD candidate over at MIT in Boston and a visiting scholar here.
Yeah, I just forgot to say everybody has to introduce himself. But you
I
did.
figured that's what the
Perfect.
microphone was for.
You know that. You're pro. Yeah.
I guess my question is, what's the Eastern side's perception of U.S. bargaining strategy throughout this process? Because it seems that as the U.S. goes from a position of parity, perhaps net inferiority early on, to what is even on the U.S. side seen as a position of military superiority, that should be reflected somehow in the U.S. position. In fact, if you look at the CFE negotiations later on, there's almost a monotonic increase in U.S. demands upon the Warsaw Pact as its own sense of the balance of power is shifting in its favor. So I'm wondering, A, if that's reflected in the MBFR talks, and B, how the Eastern Bloc saw this and saw the U.S. position changing over time.
The assessment, the documents contain country assessments of the U.S. position and other countries involved in MBFR. And the way they read the U.S. position is basically the U.S. wants to withdraw forces. It wants to find a way of reducing its commitments to Europe. And so this creates a tension between the Europeans and the United States. And the Europeans are trying to maintain the status quo. And so the Europeans are seeing as being basically at odds with the United States, trying to prevent the withdrawal of United States forces. I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, I guess there's a second component of that, which is, over the period 1973 through MBFR ended in 80. Anyone remember what year?
84.
February of 89. Thank you.
Officially, so but it was dead by then.
So it's at some point that the question of U.S. withdrawal from Europe is no longer on the table. Early on, as a matter of fact.
Yeah.
And so, what's the sense of U.S. strategy vis-a-vis the Warsaw Pact as that shift occurs? And by the way, as the offset strategy kicks in, as the Carter-Reagan buildup kicks in, certainly after the lessons of the 73 war percolate into the military mindset.
Yes, but I mean, the unilateral withdrawal of forces is off the agenda, obviously. But they think that the negotiations are targeted to achieve an objective by putting greater responsibilities on the Europeans, and obviously by achieving a concomitant decrease in Soviet forces. And I think they're very clearly aware of the fact. I mean, this is the thing that is so central. Is the question: well, are we going to get a ratification of the status quo at slightly lower levels? Or are we going to be pushed into asymmetrical reductions? And that is what they're trying to prevent. So that's the way in which that's what the documents say, at least. Yeah.
Thank you.
Tim, just next to you.
Tim McDonald from the Center. I'm just curious, as a matter of fact, to what extent, if any, was verification a tendentious issue in these negotiations? What were the plans for verification? Was it strictly national technical means and looking through your imagery and counting tanks, or was it something more complicated than that? Was this an important negotiating issue?
Well, it was an important negotiating issue in the sense that, I mean, obviously from the Soviet perspective, they were not willing to concede on-site inspections. And well, I mean, how do you evaluate somebody who doesn't even want to give their data, who doesn't give data even internally? So the question of maintaining secrecy was quite important. So verification was a major stumbling block. That's true, yeah. Because, I mean, from the Western perspective, verification would have been very important. But sorry, do you want to?
Maybe you can get the microphone. Sure. Yeah, how about you just briefly? How about just introduce yourself so we all know.
The going-in position was manpower limitations.
Right.
A colleague of mine once responded to a question, well, how do you monitor the manpower? Well, we take satellite imagery of the boots, divide by 2. So the whole issue, verification, was right from the start because the focus was on manpower. And there wasn't, other than spies, there wasn't any way to...
And especially with the mass mobilization army.
Okay.
May I?
Yeah, please.
My name is Stefan Kieninger. I have recently finished a PhD dissertation at the University of Mannheim on competing American strategies for deterrent in the 1970s, and I've also dealt with MBFR, and you have illustrated the asymmetries between East and West. And I mean, the only way to bring about reductions in 1973 at the outset of the negotiations would have been mixed package reductions between Soviet tanks and forward-based systems of the USA in Europe. I mean, that would have been the so-called option 3. What about Soviet reactions to this option 3? Could you tell us more about Soviet perceptions of this Western proposal? Would the Soviets have been prepared to play this option?
Well, their criticism, obviously, of the option 3 was they weren't willing to trade entire tank armies for the level of nuclear reductions that were proposed, but at the same time they wanted to include nuclear options into the deal, for sure. So it wasn't completely precluded. It's just the terms that were proposed, I think, were not acceptable to the Soviets.
Any further questions, comments? I don't mind at all. How about you introduce yourself first and then speak loud in the microphone?
Am I speaking loud enough now? Yeah. Okay. I was on the delegation in Vienna from 74 to 78. I also happened to be called in on the weekend when Nixon returned from Moscow in 72. That's when we had to photograph the boots, divide by 2 in order to work up the manpower data. And then I was back in arms control again for CFE, so I'm somewhat familiar with this stuff. And also had the advantage of going to the opera state plots at $1.25 for see the world's greatest while I was in Vienna. Just some of the points I wanted to make on this. First, Western going-in position with its data was a non-starter by the time the talks opened, because the numbers they were using to calculate the position, when you talked about option 3, if you check with Kissinger, and I think it's the White House Years book, he writes about it, you always put 3 options, put the one you want in the middle, and then pick that one. And to pick that one, it was equal percentage reductions, common ceiling, and tanks for Pershing 1s. And so the going-in position was based on the fact that the numbers being used were such that an equal percentage reduction versus a common ceiling was not that asymmetrical an amount they'd cut. By the time the talks opened, the numbers had ratcheted way the heck up, so that now a common ceiling would have had them cutting double or more than what the West would have been. And so that was, it was a non-starter. And then later on, there was I think in 76, when they tabled their data, in the lead up to that, there was expected a solution to the problem, but sometime between Tuesday and Thursday, they changed their mind. And so the issue of the data thing became I can't use the proper term.
I mean, Chuck Dean and Stanley Razor, the heads of the delegation, wanted to play option 3.
Oh no, they wanted to play option 3 because
Kissinger didn't.
Right, but the reason they wanted to play option 3 is because they went in with option 2, and it was dead in the water by the time the boat started, and so they were constantly pushing to get option 3 out because they figured that was the only fallback position they could do. And so, as I say, that's why they chose the common ceiling, but on the assumption, or on data that said it won't be that asymmetrical. And by the time the talk started, and then after I'm sorry to say, we caught just by flat, kind of use the word lie, but anyway, false data. And then they spent the whole next few years trying to get this solved, and all they did was dig themselves deeper in a hole. And by the early 1980s, I said this boat had sunk as far as a couple points, though. I think it might. I mentioned the Air Force issue, air manpower issue didn't come into the talks much until the asymmetric ground force data looked so formidable. We have lots more air manpower than they do, so we'll add those in. Well, by the time we had to explain to them, no, that's not true either. You're going to stay with the asymmetry. The reason I made some notes here, if you don't mind. I asked you about that. By the early 80s, I mean, one thing a lot of people, you might want to take a look at this in your research. One of the things that really played heavily in the willingness by the 1980s to pursue strategic nuclear arms control or reductions was because the Soviet military was saying, my God, they're going way ahead of us in the conventional capability, and that's the war you might actually have to fight. And I could even quote one senior military officer in the General Staff saying, nuclear war is a war that can never be fought and no one can win. So there was a movement to move to a more of a deterrent status as opposed to a nuclear warfighting status, and therefore save a whole lot of rubles that we can spend to try to catch up with this conventional lead. And that really was figured in, I say, by 83, 84, that was definitely on the table. And I think if you'll check history, you'll find that Gorbachev, within about a week of taking office, met with his senior military out in Minsk to say, don't worry, you're going to get what you need. So, as I said, this whole conventional asymmetry you're describing had a rotating effect on the national policy over there. I think that may be, the idea that data was not shared with diplomats. There was more than one occasion when some foreign diplomats passed us a paper in Washington and asked us to check the data they were getting before they put it on the table. I can't give the details of that one. Anyway, so this was, but this was all part of it. And then finally, I was going to say, and you haven't gone into this, but when Gorbachev made the ATT, the Atlantic to the Ural speech, he brought conventional arms control back up, because then that covered Ukraine, Belarus, and Spain, Portugal, or whatever. I mean, the MBFR territorial line was drawn such that it was not going to work either, and this one expanded it. So anyway, that's enough for me one day.
Thank you. You want to have any short comment, or you're just right on that?
No, I have another question.
Yeah, do you have a response to the actual thing?
No, I'm interested to hear what you're saying, and generally I agree with what you're saying. I mean, of course, once nuclear arms control had become very successful in terms of the INF, then, of course, from the Western side, the conventional issue had to be addressed, because in Europe, suddenly, everybody was getting afraid, well, this makes Europe once again safe for conventional war. So there was, if Gorbachev wanted to advance the political agenda in Europe, there was no choice but to quite dramatically engage in conventional arms control. And shifting from manpower to equipment, obviously, was extremely important, because that was much more doable and verifiable.
Does your examination of the records in East German records, do they analyze American leadership, like President Carter, Jimmy Carter, or the Secretary of State, and do they analyze Ronald Reagan, for example, in the documents?
In the specific documents that I've looked at, which relate to the National Security Council and to the MBFR very specifically, that's not the case, no. They just talk generally about, American ruling circles. For example, I mean, I'll just, and coming back to a question that was asked earlier, it says about the United States, for domestic, political, and economic reasons, important circles in the United States sought a relatively rapid reduction in the troops based in Europe in order to be able to continue US global strategy, which they call the Nixon Doctrine, and the West Europeans were to assume greater burdens. So it's a fairly generic analysis of United States policy, but not of individual leaders. That doesn't mean that it can't be found in East German documents, and I think I might look for that now that you've mentioned it, because that might be interesting.
Let me ask a second question then. What happens when the Euro missiles come into the Air Force cruise missiles and the Pershing 2s and so on? We know there's mass demonstrations in the Netherlands and Great Britain and Germany, Italy, and so on. Does this influence the negotiations? Do they comment on it?
The only comments that I've found in the files were related to the fact that cruise missiles were seen as one of the central elements of the new strike capabilities of the United States. Of course, these are not necessarily nuclear-armed cruise missiles, but in terms of the... No, the Euro missile debate is not in those documents. No, it's not in there, no. But again, since I've only had... When I did this research, they were only partially declassified. Now that the whole file has been declassified, I hope to be able to deepen that research and maybe find something on that.
I just wanted to ask this gentleman to identify himself. I was just fascinated by your comments.
Bond, James Bond. No. My name is Doug McCacken. I retired from the intelligence business, but as I said, I was accidentally walked into the conventional weapons threat assessment just about the time that the summit was held in Moscow, and when it was May of '72, and I got pulled into this thing, and then later went back into arms control. In part because, contrary to popular belief, there were some of us that knew by 1988, 89 that we were at a historical threshold. And I volunteered what was viewed then as a demotion to go take this arm control staff. But most important, best 4 years of my life were the next 4 years when we got Start 1, Start 2, CFE. Pardon? Oh, and INF was actually 87, though, wasn't it?
87, yeah.
But and it'd work on that, and by the way, the Pershing 2 issue was the big one, and it was interesting that I think it was Willy Brandt made a speech over in the IIS,
yes,
in 87, 86, 87, that said he supported it, and boy, that really had a ripple effect too. So anyway, as I said, I just happened to be there and. Had the good luck to be there when the treaty was signed, and although I have to confess to you that it almost didn't get signed because of this number problem, because the data that were tabled were supposedly contrary to what some people still believe, because they couldn't believe that this few tens of thousands we suddenly discovered out in Siberia had actually come from the east. So the issue, essentially, the issue was pushed. How can you prove they came from the east? Well, did they come from outer space, or where the hell did they come from? But that was an issue right up to within hours of the signing of the treaty. And so, pardon?
The CFE treaty.
Yeah. So, and the data issue, as I said, it was always an issue because how can you trust, but verify?
But even then, I mean, for example, looking at START, I found comments in the East German archives on START. They used ISS data in their own secret files. And a little note saying, this has not been published in our media. But there's an interesting little footnote to the INF Treaty, which has to do with the fact that there was this little missile called the Oka, which was just around the 500-kilometer range. And the NVA wanted to keep it. They didn't want to. They had some from, of course, they didn't have nuclear munitions for it. But they had the Oka, and they wanted to find a way of keeping the Oka, and they conspired with the Soviet military for them to actually keep the Oka, because they said, well, it doesn't belong to the Soviet Union. It's not a nuclear missile. Why shouldn't we keep that? And then there was a whole debate about, well, how can you sort of manipulate the range, or have the idea that somehow it's not quite 500 kilometers, so it doesn't fall under the purview of the treaty. So there's a whole file on this, and how they thought sometime later they might be able to introduce this in arms control negotiations. Obviously not understanding the fact that this, from the American side, this would be considered to be cheating. And there was no way that if you cheat, you can then use this as a bargaining tool in arms control negotiations. And also very unclear for what purpose. But nevertheless, I think this is quite an interesting insight how they were thinking about those kinds of matters, and how sort of the Soviet military itself was conspiring by giving them the missiles, and which were obviously going to be used with conventional warheads.
Can I make, for one thing I made a note on, I forgot to, is this whole issue of the numerical superiority in conventional ground forces. One small anecdote, by the way, one of the problems you had in trying to separate the ground forces from the air forces is in Czechoslovakia, if you were part of a air defense missile unit, if you were part of the army, whereas in East Germany, if you were part of the Air Force, and so the uniform's color affected the data count. This whole issue of numerical superiority, I mean, if you go back, that was the justification for the tactical, the nuclear response, because, oh my gosh, how will you handle this massive tank human body wave? So that was the first explanation for the nuclear. Then after they could shoot the United States also, well, then we went to the McNamara's graduated response, where all the tactical nuclear weapons went in there, and they came in from the other side. Well, then INF was developed under Schlesinger because, let's see, we had to have, they attack us, we use tactical nukes, they use tactical nukes. Well, that gives us the option to shoot from North Dakota, and then they can shoot back at North Dakota. Okay, so now we'll put this new missile, Pershing II, in Europe, so we can fire from Germany and hit Moscow, or close to it. So this whole issue of the nuclear and conventional forces, the U.S. argument, justification for much of its nuclear program was the massive, quantitative at least, superiority on the eastern side in the conventional war. And so that was the way the whole thing evolved, and INF between I think February of '88, when Gorbachev publicly in effect decoupled it. Right. It was a done deal then, just had to work out the details. And
all of these treaties indicate that the major the major historical figure here is Gorbachev. Gorbachev simply changed Soviet strategy in Central Europe and nuclear strategy as well. He ordered 500,000 men pulled out of Central Europe at the United Nations, and so on. And Gorbachev is not, Reagan's important because he's an interlocutor here, but Gorbachev is the key figure.
I don't want to make too much of this.
Okay, one more and then you. Yeah.
Then I'll give it up. You're absolutely right, and as I said, in fact, the very first practical important meeting Gorbachev held was with the senior military staff, and that's because of another issue that nobody really wanted. And the economy was going down the tubes, and they only had one pot to go to for the kind of capital investment they needed in their civilian industrial base, and that was the military base. And his own military agreed with him that they were, and so from there on out, as you say, from April '85 was when he walked into office, about 3 in the morning, and it finally was settled. But and then from there on out, if you'll take a look at what happened, and everybody always asks, when did I think the Cold War ended? I'll tell you, November '85, Gorbachev and Reagan met in Geneva, and that was what started you down a path which brought you to where the outcome. So you can't, as I say, Gorbachev was and his supporting group. He had a group that Yakovlev and a few others that.
But you mentioned Schlesinger. Of course, I mean, the Europeans were a major driving force behind INF, because for them there was the real problem that if you had a lot of short-range systems, the shorter the range, the deader the Germans, basically. And the idea that you could actually, I think it was a way, first of all, of binding the United States into escalation and to be able to hit Soviet, to put Soviet territory at risk and limit the use of nuclear weapons on European territory, or on German territory specifically. Yeah, so, but then when you had INF in 1987, you had the same paradox again, that suddenly the only nuclear weapons left were the very short-range weapons.
Before I call on you, let me just make one remark about the data issue. If we would have the full record of the East German military intelligence, plus the East German military attaché files, which are extremely important, let's say the East German military attaché based at the embassy in Moscow, I'm pretty sure we would have more reliable data on Soviet and Warsaw Pact capabilities, because the relationship was very close in many regards between the militaries of both sides. But those files have been mostly, lost, I would say, taken home by people in 1990, or destroyed, or whatever happened to them. So if you go to the military archive in Freiburg, where you did most of your research, the military attaché files, usually after 1964, are either extremely spotty or not existent. But this was a huge cache of data. So I think they had this data, but yes, they did not share it with the foreign ministry. Maybe in certain cases they went to the top leadership, which then also did not share it with them. So, but I would still presume that the East German high political leadership, as well as the East German military, was pretty much aware of the exact figures of the Soviet Union, because the relationship between these people on site in Moscow, the East German and Soviet military, I think was extremely close. And what you sometimes see in some glimpses of Stasi files where you have a copy of East German military intelligence, they have pretty good data. So, but usually you cannot really assess them in a systematic way in the archive, so it looks like they didn't share it. Well, they have the internal secrecy mechanisms, but I think the data were known also to very loyal allies like the East Germans. And the Polish army leadership was the second one. Right, so, right, and from what Olaf I heard also from East German generals, I mean, they were very close to each other, I mean, in many regards. Anyway, so yeah, Mr.
Yeah. Concerning this data issue, I have another inquiry. I mean, Jonathan Dean makes the case that this Soviet data, were reliable or were given to the West in the context of the Stockholm Conference on confidence-building measures in 1984. What would be your assessment? Is there any reliable information on this in the East German files or in other files, or what do other contemporaries say on this?
I didn't specifically study CFE, but I did see some documents on CFE in the East German archives, and there it seems to be the data are much more extensive and reliable, actually. Yeah, so I think they do exist at that time. Yeah, but before then, there was this enormous paranoia that the data were really guarded as a closed secret, and even internally only very selectively released.
And I mean, that's when the whole MBFR thing rather becomes oblivious, because it's all discussed in the CSCE context now, because the scope of confidence building measures is like expanded to up to the Ural Mountains and so forth, and
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I mean, by the mid-80s, clearly MBFR had run its course and was no longer relevant, and the momentum of political change, I think, then, I mean, clearly, I think it's very interesting, because I remember this time very clearly. It shows my age, perhaps, but I was in London. I was discussing these things with people at the time, and I was looking at that time very specifically at what the Soviet Union was up to, and I said, look at Gorbachev's speeches. He is talking about the demilitarization of the Cold War in Europe. If you take this really seriously, I think we had a hard time. I think it probably took us maybe 3 years at least to believe that might be possible, maybe until INF Treaty came about or whatever. Yes, there was the change was a political change, clearly.
First American he got to buy in was Ronald Reagan. Unfortunately, Reagan didn't get the rest of his unions to buy in. He couldn't.
Well, I mean, Ronald Reagan was willing to almost take the Reykjavik deal. So And in fact, Start 1 is sort of maybe a third way of the first tranche of Reykjavik. Well, no more than a third, almost. Maybe 37% reduction as opposed to 50% reduction for the first phase of Reykjavik. So it was, of course, again, the international context changed after that.
And who changed it? It was Gorbachev. Gorbachev lost it with Reykjavik, went back, and 3 months later he comes back with another proposal, which shocked everybody.
Yes, and we're still trying to understand why that exactly happened. I mean, apart from, there is a very strong opinion in some circles that SDI was a major factor, but in my reading of the documents that I've seen, and also this other analysis, after they got over the initial shock of SDI, which they really thought they might be outraced by the Americans, they had a much more limited view of what the SDI might actually accomplish. So
I can comment on too.
Can you maybe for microphone? That was hard for everybody to understand.
There's no, you can, before Gorbachev came into office, there's tons of samizdat that will tell you they all knew their economy was going crazy. And they also had an internal societal problem in the ethnic divides and stratums. So, but Gorbachev, what enabled him to even come into office, and if you look at the records or the things about the debate that went on half the night, it was, we're going to go back and fix this economy and let ourselves catch up with the West. And so these things they were doing were say, this is what we have to do in the interest of the Soviet Union, and we have to bring down our military expenditure. And the biggest pot, in terms of the amount it was getting, was the strategic nuclear and missile and every pot. So yes, it went straight towards the missiles, but they had to go conventional as well, at least until they could catch up with the efficiency and technology. So, as I said, you can't, you can go clear back to the 1970s and see internal papers that are written that are saying what a mess we're in. And there was a cafe society. In fact, you might read a book by a Czech named Zdeněk Milnář, who went to college there in the 50s. One of his classmates was a guy named Mikhail Sergeyevich. And he will tell you even then that Gorbachev was of this educated, upcoming younger group at that time who wanted to open the society. And so this was a case of the historical, societal evolution, if we can call it that said this nonsense of face-to-face and this Iron Curtain and all that. I mean, there was lots of movement on that, and Gorbachev took the lead in it. And he was the one that caused, when he got the job, then he could exercise the authority, and he had support. He also had some opposition, as you remember.
Yeah, I think, but what also shouldn't get lost on this picture, just following right up on that, from what you can read when Gorbachev has his multilateral meetings with other Warsaw Pact leaders then during the 80s, second half of the 80s, I think he considered himself really to be on the political offensive, not being a defensive measure by the Soviet Union, who is in certain economic trouble and has to agree on certain arms reductions, but actually using the issue of arms reduction as a tool to attract widespread sympathy for the Soviet Union within Eastern Europe, particularly within Western Europe, at the expense of the United States, basically by outdoing the United States in terms of true, real disarmament, and maybe also contributing to a further decoupling, actually, of Western Europe from the United States and making the Soviet Union really a very attractive international partner, and at the same time playing, of course, to audiences in the Warsaw Pact who were, of course, not very excited about all the burden of the arms race. So I think he considered it, at least in the beginning, really as a win-win situation for the Soviet Union and for himself. And he was basking really in this glory when he got raving reports in the West, and he was quoting them. And he also defined it, of course, obviously quite misguided in this way, but also as a sort of sympathy for a reformed, attractive socialism and for the Soviet Union under his leadership. So yeah, I think he personally, I think he really considered himself to be on the offensive, while the West people, of course, noticed there's a huge chance to help to take down the entire thing over there, but he's not aware of it, to the contrary. Yeah.
But I could just add another interesting little tidbit, which has to do with the interest that some people in Gorbachev's environment had in these West German ideas of defensive defense. Now, looking at the at the East German military archives, you can see the utter contempt with which the military treated this thing. I mean, they had these documents. They were obviously forced to read them from the West Germans, and they just chucked them into the files. And then you have all these kinds of protocols of conversations in which they completely denigrate these very ideas. So, I mean, it's quite clear that they didn't buy into that at all.
In the 1970s.
1980s, yeah.
1980s.
1980s, yeah.
Yeah. Gorbachev had, starting in 1985, held 7 summits over the next 7 years with U.S. leaders. And summits were very significant because they did reach decisions at the summits and so on. And most of these negotiating treaties were discussed at the summits and so on. Gorbachev also met with every European leader and had long discussions with the Italians, the French, the British, the Germans, and so on. So it was an extremely active diplomatic period.
I have a question on a very point.
Just wait for a microphone, please. It's coming. Here it is.
I used to be a Marine and yell at the troops that are on it.
But the acoustics in the room are not the screen.
On that very point, this is another thing, is this, you look at these little benchmarks when, maybe that isn't the benchmark when history changed, but maybe it was the benchmark when I realized, or somewhat we should realize, was, what was it, 85 when Gorbachev, 86 when he made his trip to East Berlin? His first one, anyway. The point being that the message that came out of this is no more, invasions of East Europe or something with Soviet troops. And boy, there were some of us were saying, my God, what happens when that gets around? Okay, we don't have to kowtow anymore. And it did get around. And the East Europeans did start to say, well, we are independent nation states. And so, as I said, in other words, there was a metaphor in a book by an American writer called Lenin's Tomb, but the comparison he makes is you walk up to the coffin with Lenin's tomb in there and you lift the lid and the mummy disintegrates, and that was his analogy for what Gorbachev did in the 85, 86, 87 time frame. And all the things that took place after that were in response to this seismic shift.
Yes, and I agree with you. That was the central factor in the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact. Then, absolutely, there's no question. Once it was clear he was no longer willing to use force to maintain it, then it couldn't be maintained. I think he was just surprised at the speed with which the East Europeans abandoned the Soviet Union. But there's another very interesting little point that I wanted to make, which has to do with the position of East Germany, because East Germany, from very early on, was really living beyond its means, and it was always it considered itself as the most advanced country in the Soviet bloc, so to speak. But actually, they kept relying more and more by becoming financially dependent on West Germany. And in the late 1970s, the KGB did a study of this, and it concluded that this was increasing to such a level that at some point this would result in political change. And Gromyko took these reports and just put them away, because the only way to deal with this would have been, first of all, for the Soviet Union to take up the burden of supporting East Germany, and secondly, they might deal with serious social unrest if the standard of living of the East Germans were to be reduced. And so they decided not to do anything about this, even though they recognized that there was a serious danger arising from the increasing thirst of hard currency, which was dealt with by borrowing money from West Germany.
So you mentioned a little bit ago about contempt within the East German army for the West German concept of defensive defense. And what time frame was that?
Yeah, that was in the 1980s, yeah, mid-80s.
Mid-1980s, okay. I mean, so a little while back, the Cold War Project published a roundtable discussion on a bunch of newly released Polish Warsaw Pact military exercises. And one of the things that that Mark Kramer wrote in his write-up on this was that as far as he's concerned, the seed of the idea of the Soviet shift from rapid counteroffensive, a rapid counteroffensive strategy, or offensive or counteroffensive, depending on how you decide to term it, for the defense of the Warsaw Pact. That the seeds of that shift started, to a more defensive orientation, started way back in 1986. So we just recently published another speech by General Akhromeyev to the Polish General Staff, sort of outlining the details of this shift that was from, I think it was January 1988, suggesting that there was a tide that had to be turned here. This is decades of counteroffensive doctrine that had to be rolled back, and it took a couple of years to do this. So can you talk, based on what you've seen, about the internal Warsaw Pact discussions about this shift in doctrine, to the extent that you've seen them? If the East Germans were, the thrust of my question is, if the East Germans were criticizing their West German opponents for emphasis on the defense, what were they saying about their Soviet allies who are now shifting to emphasize the defense?
Well, I think there are several levels at which you can look at that. I mean, obviously, there was a clear criticism in Moscow of the previous strategy, and also of the scope of the counter-offensive. And I think the key element was that the counter-offensive should basically be stop at the status quo ante. That would be the new policy, rather than trying to occupy the whole of Western Europe. The documents I refer to really had to do with the fact, I mean, defensive defense obviously goes much further. It looks at what kind of military technology is defensive, what isn't defensive, and really not have any counter-offensive at all in that in the classical sense. And I think what happened at this point, they were mandated to look at this from the top, and they were not very impressed with that. That's what I have found in the documents.
Any further questions or comments here? Yeah. May I ask one final question, whether you found something about that in your documents? What I've seen in previous documents, and sometimes although in transcripts of talks with East German generals, is that they felt under certain pressure by the Soviet Union, ever-increasing pressure, particularly by the early 80s, to do more in terms of East German arms production. And supporting basically the Warsaw Pact military capabilities through the increase of arms production in East Germany, because East Germany was considered to really have the technology and the equipment to do that. And there were quite some debates, all on the highest level, which usually went all the way up to Honecker, where the East Germans signaled that they are in a special situation. Of course, they're in the contest with West Germany. They also, of course, have hugely indebted to West Germany, as everybody knew. But they also that there is already the dressing window to the West, and they have to maintain a certain living standard for their own people in order to avoid social unrest, whatever. So they really cannot increase their military capabilities. And it was quite, I think, a very contentious issue. Now, when Gorbachev came to power, what I sensed is that in a way there was a sort of Soviet payback, although to the East Germans, for really having spurned the Soviets so long on this issue. So when the East Germans now had certain concerns about some shifts in Soviet strategies or Soviet disarmament policy, did they feel sort of reminded to the initial really high horse position that they are not supposed to have to share the burden like everybody else, because they are about they're working for butter and for guns, right? But now, when the Soviet Union was basically changing its strategy, that the East German military and the political leadership lost maybe part of its standing and reputation with the Soviet Union, who now basically pushed ahead without taking their concerns too serious anymore.
Okay. Well, first of all, we come in from the situation where in the early 80s rather, the tension between the United States and Soviet Union is at such a level that the Germans, both East and West, have a serious problem about being trapped into a conflict, possibly a nuclear conflict. And at that time, Helmut Schmidt and Honecker made a deal saying, we are not going to use nuclear weapons. If it comes to the point of using nuclear weapons, we are going to cease all hostilities. Then when Gorbachev comes, of course, the background for Gorbachev is Honecker is not on the same page with Gorbachev at all. I mean, they are still recalcitrant. They are still unreformed, and that's how Gorbachev looks at the East Germans. Now, of course, Honecker was extremely naughty because he sold off all the stockpiles of munitions for hard cash. So, in that sense, this was a very serious problem for the Soviets, the way in which the East Germans were handling this. But I think that the relationship between Honecker and Gorbachev never came to anything. I mean, they were diametrically opposed, to the point, as we know, that at some point Soviet newspapers were no longer available in East Germany because of the difference in view.
Okay, thank you very much. So any further questions? So, well, then I think we thank you for a very inspiring talk and for a very good discussion. And I think it was a great pleasure to have you here. And thank you, everybody, for coming. So let's give you a final round of applause.